we'll be doing a little bit of a Q&A. So tonight is Ask the Dietitian. So we've had some of our friends submit questions on a link that Anthony provided for us. We'll also be taking questions from Facebook. So if you want to ask him anything, just type it in the comments and I'll read it to him as we go along. So Anthony, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, as always, for allowing me to speak with you all this evening. And yes, I see a couple really interesting and very good questions have been asked already. So I'll just sort of go through the list in terms of the order that I received them and just share a little bit of information about them. So the first question that was shared was, is the Mediterranean diet a good choice for newly diagnosed early stage breast cancer? And this is a wonderful question. So thank you for having posed this question. So to answer this, there's a couple different things we need to look at, and one of which is even to attempt to define what the Mediterranean diet is, because this is one of those terms that really gets used quite liberally, quite often. People talk about the Mediterranean diet, but the Mediterranean isn't some teeny tiny place. There's a number of countries and a number of different people and different cultures and cuisines that make up this region that is referred to as the Mediterranean. So when we look at the research that's done in terms of this dietary pattern that is sort of overwhelmingly called the Mediterranean diet, what is it really referring to, and what are the health benefits associated with it? So the Mediterranean diet is not a diet just laden with olive oil, although that is sometimes what people kind of market it to be. And I remember one time even seeing a recipe being touted as a really healthy recipe, Mediterranean dessert, and it was just a cake that used olive oil instead of butter. And I'm not saying that that's not a good thing or a bad thing or anything, but it just sort of cracked me up that that's all it was. Just because they put olive oil in the cake recipe, they said it's Mediterranean diet. So what is the actual Mediterranean diet in terms of this association with disease risk, heart disease, cancer, breast cancer, et cetera? This dietary pattern that is referred to as Mediterranean is one that is incredibly high in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, olive oil as a replacement for things like lard or butter or solid fat. So while there are certainly health benefits to olive oil, it is also the fact that it is replacing many of these high saturated fat oils and other foods, which I'll talk actually more about with our second question that was asked. And it utilizes plant-based sources of protein, beans, peas, lentils, legumes, as a majority of the diet, as opposed to meat or fish or eggs or pork or poultry, which make up a much smaller amount, with seafood being the most predominant source of animal protein compared to anything else. Now, that hopefully should not shock anybody in terms of recommendations for a healthy diet. I mean, this is something that has been documented over and over and over, of diets that are incredibly high in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, beans, peas, lentils, um, whole plant-based sources of fats like avocados, nuts, seeds, and then if using cooking oil, olive oil, real olive oil, as opposed to heavily processed oils or solid animal fats or things like that. These absolutely are associated with lower risk of certain diseases. And I will say breast cancer is one of them. Breast cancer, especially because breast cancers very often are hormonally driven, estrogen receptive positive, and things of that nature. Um, it is very malleable to our environment then. So the things that we engage in with the environment can really play quite a role for certain health conditions like cancer and like breast cancer in particular, where our levels of estrogens and other hormones are very much impacted. So what do we know about the dietary recommendations to reduce risk for breast cancer, or many different forms of cancer, I should say? Well, if we look at articles and research that's being published with the American Institute of Cancer Research and other organizations that try to compile this information together, the same recommendations that they are making are mirrored in a high quality Mediterranean diet. So diets rich in vegetables, rich in fruits, very high in fiber, especially from whole grains, beans, peas, lentils, nuts, and seeds. Using these beans, peas, lentils, nuts, and seeds as a majority of our source of protein, with other sources of animal-based protein being much reduced, in particular, little to no red meat and no processed meat. So these would be things like bacon and sausage and lunch meats and those sorts of things. Well, these mirror the Mediterranean diet really well. And so if somebody wanted to use the Mediterranean diet pattern as a way of following some of these dietary recommendations, that would be wonderful. But please note, it's not that there's anything special to the foods of the Mediterranean. You could follow those same guidelines: high plant, high fiber, very high in multicolored fruits and vegetables, with a great reduction in animal-based foods, processed oils, and things of that nature, and processed foods. Well, that can be replicated in foods that you might see in Egyptian cooking, in Southeast Asian cooking. These might be foods that you see reflected in Latinx cooking. These patterns can be replicated in almost any type of dietary pattern. And I did want to emphasize this because sometimes people hear about the Mediterranean diet or whatever it is that it might be and think, well, now I have to only cook foods from the Mediterranean. And if that sounds like heaven to you, then by all means do it. But it's patterns. There's nothing magic about olive oil. If you don't cook with olive oil, but you use, lots of saturated fat laden foods, the olive oil has its benefits, but really where the benefit typically comes from is as a replacement for these more heavily processed fats or these solid animal fats, these high saturated fat foods. So it doesn't need to necessarily be any one food or any one style of cooking. But if you're finding recipes or if you're finding information that will help you follow a diet high in fiber, low in saturated fat, rich in multicolored fruits and vegetables, very high in plant-based sources of protein, and that happens to be Mediterranean focused, wonderful. But it need not only be Mediterranean. There's nothing special about any one region of the world's culinary practices. It's more that people who follow these patterns seem to be exhibiting some really wonderful health benefits. One more thing I wanted to say about that, and then we'll go to our second question that was asked, is about alcohol. Because sometimes with Mediterranean diets and these sorts of things, the message kind of gets hijacked a little bit to start pushing alcohol, especially wine and red wine in particular. For breast cancer, and this is true of many other types of cancers, but I'm emphasizing breast cancer because that was the cancer mentioned in the question. Alcohol absolutely increases risk for breast cancer. Any amount of alcohol increases risk for breast cancer. Now, does this mean a person absolutely can never drink a single drop of alcohol again? No, not necessarily. But alcohol increases the risk of breast cancer, any amount to some degree. And so sometimes in these discussions that happened around this, there sometimes is this message of, drink lots of red wine, it's good for you. Um, is red wine healthier for me than perhaps some other alcoholic beverages I could choose? Perhaps so. But if your goal is to prevent, or if you are currently living with better help to manage and treat, or if you're a survivor of breast cancer and your goal is to prevent recurrence, as little to no alcohol as possible. Interestingly, in the dietary guidelines for Americans, in the most recent edition that just got published, one of the recommendations that was attempted to be pushed through, but unfortunately didn't make it through this time, was for men and women both to be recommended to drink one or fewer alcoholic drinks a day. Right now, the recommendations are one or fewer drinks a day for women and two or fewer drinks a day for men. And they were going to change that to say, no, men, women, regardless, one or fewer a day. So I would encourage anyone who is using their dietary habits, their dietary patterns as a way to try to reduce their risk of cancer, if they are a cancer survivor, prevent recurrence, or if they are currently undergoing treatment for cancer to maximize the effectiveness of their treatment, maximize the healing that is occurring within their body. Alcohol, even red wine and things like that, as little to none as you can possibly do on a day-to-day basis. And so I just feel that needs to be said, because again, sometimes these things get published about East Asian cooking and eating patterns and health, or Mediterranean cooking patterns and eating patterns and health. And then one little thing gets kind of exploded and say, well, the Mediterraneans use olive oil and drink red wine, so therefore it must be the olive oil and red wine. We want to look at the larger pattern of what is happening. So that's my very long answer to that question, but I hope that gives you some information that can be helpful. The second question that was asked was about heart health, specifically cholesterol. What is the best way to go on a low-fat diet in order to reduce higher cholesterol? Excellent question. Um, Much like the breast cancer, actually, it is the type of fat that is sometimes even more important than the total amount of fat we eat. And I want to say this because in the efforts sometimes to eat a lower fat diet, which to be honest, most people benefit from finding ways to reduce some of the fat in their diet, um, everything is sort of reduced all at once. And so what tends to sometimes be problematic about that is sustainability. If you have many sources of fat in your diet and you have high cholesterol in this case, and you want to reduce that cholesterol, going on a lower fat diet is a wonderful step towards lowering your high levels of cholesterol, especially your LDL and total cholesterol. But it really changes the texture and it really changes the mouthfeel and the flavor and many other things of the foods you're eating. And so sometimes people go on these very, very, very low fat diets and they can only do them for a couple days, couple weeks, couple months because the food is just so different from how they had been eating and is potentially really lacking in maybe some enjoyment and lacking in palatability, and it's not sustainable. When it comes to cholesterol, there are two types of fats that are especially problematic to raising and keeping our cholesterol high. Those are trans fats and saturated fats. Trans fats, for the most part, don't seem to really exist in nature. There are certain animal foods that naturally are sources of trans fats, but the majority of people get trans fats from hydrogenated and partially hydrogenated oil, which is almost exclusively found in packaged and processed foods. So if you're looking at a box of something, let's say it's crackers at the store, look at the ingredient list. And if you see the words hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated anywhere on that ingredient list, my recommendation would be to put it back and find another brand or find another option, because any amount of hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oil is a source of trans fats. You can't trust the upper part of the food label that says 0 grams trans fats. There's some tricky laws out there that allow them to round things down to 0, and that's not good. But the ingredient list tells us everything. So if you see that word hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, skip it. The other thing is saturated fat. And I know I was just kind of ranting about saturated fat when it came to breast cancer, but high intakes of saturated fats are more and more being linked to a variety of chronic health issues. Heart disease, type 2 diabetes, certain autoimmune conditions are being looked at right now with high saturated fat diets, and even certain types of cancers. So going on a lower saturated fat diet in particular is a very wise choice to make, and it will do a lot to help reduce cholesterol. The sources of saturated fats tend to be foods that are high in what we might sometimes refer to as like solid fats. And so coconut oil. If you ever look at a jar of coconut oil, here we are in January, right? It's solid at room temperature. That is really high in saturated fat. Palm oil. If you've ever seen a jar of palm oil, it is solid at room temperature. Butter, right? Butter is going to be a really high source of saturated fat. Most margarines, to be honest, especially, yeah, they're really quite firm. They have to firm that up somehow. It's typically palm or coconut or some other type of oil in there. The yolks of eggs, pretty high source of saturated fat. Red meat. And red meat, by the way, is more than just beef. Sometimes people think red meat is just beef. Red meat is anything that comes from a mammal, anything that is coming from something other than a sea animal or a bird or something, that's red meat. So in other words, muscle, just beef or venison or pork or all these different things, they're going to be sources of saturated fats. And so, like my previous answer to the other question, diets that are very rich in fruits, vegetables, and plant-based sources of protein as opposed to animal-based sources, beans, peas, lentils, nuts, and seeds. I promise I'll stop saying that. But these are going to, in addition to being great sources of fiber, which is, by the way, wonderful for your cholesterol, they're going to be great sources of dietary protein, but they're also incredibly low in saturated fats. So that is typically the way I recommend people try to adopt, yes, a lower fat diet, but really it's more of a lower saturated fat, little to no trans fat diet that really can be a tremendous help forward, at least a good first step, and see how your LDL cholesterol and your total cholesterol respond. So if I'm cooking dinner and I'm making, let's say, stir fry, and I would normally stir fry up beef, well, if I replace that with stir-fried vegetables that I maybe do half the amount of beef I normally would, that's a big cut down in saturated fat. Or if I say, okay, instead of beef today, I'm going to put tempeh in there, or I'm going to put sliced up shreds of tofu in there, or I'm going to do a black bean and vegetable stir fry or something like that, right? That's going to be even greater reduction. With other sources of fats that are not saturated, like monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats, these are found in things like olives and olive oil, avocados, and nuts and seeds like walnuts and almonds and flax seeds and chia seeds and sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds. These are much higher in mono and polyunsaturated fats, which means they do not raise your cholesterol. So I find that it typically is a little more enjoyable and more sustainable to not go on this zero fat diet, which is really quite difficult to maintain, and frankly may not be even the best way to go about this, and rather think about it more of a substitution, right? I'm replacing maybe my margarine or my butter with olive oil, or I'm replacing it with smushed up avocado on bread, or I'm doing a little bit of almond butter or tahini or something like that instead. Instead of using a lot of high saturated fat foods that have, again, coconut oil, palm kernel oil, all these things, I'm making sure to find salad dressings or sauces or marinades that don't have these oils in them. Or when I'm cooking at home or when I'm going to a restaurant, where can I get some plant-based alternatives? So where can I go with, beans or peas or tempeh or tofu or these sorts of things instead? Do that for, couple weeks, couple months. Next time you get your cholesterol check, just see how you've responded. Depending on the breadth of changes you've made, you may see some particularly significant changes happening while also reducing, yes, your total fat intake, no doubt, but it's also switching out the quality and the sources of the fats that can make a big difference. One kind of approach to this that I really like is something called the portfolio diet. I don't really like the D word. I don't like diet, but it's just, if you Google the portfolio diet or something like that, it'll come up. But I find it to be a really nice approach out there because it absolutely follows these guidelines, but not in a way that demonizes all sources of dietary fats. So I just find sometimes people have a little bit of a easier time with it. They enjoy it more, and they're still getting a lot of these wonderful benefits. So those are some things to consider if you do have high total cholesterol or high LDL cholesterol. Making some of these substitutions, some of these changes can be pretty helpful. And then the third question that was posed, which is a very interesting one, was I just read about sea moss. Can you tell us about the benefits and how to use it? And that's a great question. I frankly don't think I've ever been asked about sea moss before. So sea moss is a sea vegetable. And it's been getting some popularity recently for some reasons that are good and some reasons that really aren't so good, but let's talk about what it is. So sea moss is a sea vegetable, and like many sea vegetables, it has a very unique texture. Sea moss is very high in something, or it's also sometimes called carrageenan moss, or carrageen moss, so that it's very thickening. The way that sea moss is typically prepared, it's a type of red seaweed, is that it's very gelatinous. And so often it is used to thicken things. You don't really eat it. Although, again, with the popularity of influencers and certain things on social media and stuff, people are making like sea moss smoothies and all these things now. But it's typically used as a thickener. sea moss truly does not have much in the way of nutritional benefits. It's not unhealthy by any means, but it's not really this powerhouse of nutrients. The only exception is it actually is a pretty significant source of iron. Something like maybe a quarter cup of sea moss has between 10 to 20% of your daily value of iron, um, depending on your sex and depending on your age and certain things. So it is a source of iron, but it's not really a great source of too much else. Some people who are looking to use certain types of thickeners in their cooking, especially if they are ironically trying to do maybe a lower fat preparation of something, they want to use less oil than they normally would, but they still want that mouth feel. Will sometimes use sea moss or sea moss powder because it kind of gelatinizes and thickens up, and it can be a replacement for that. I myself don't really use it. I've only eaten it once, and I didn't really love the texture of it. It really works better almost like in puddings or mousses or things like that because it is very mucilaginous. It's very sticky. The only other benefit to it in other sea vegetables that are high in this kind of mucilaginous fiber is it can help with digestive regularity. It can help with bowel movements and bowel regularity because it's a very sticky, goopy kind of texture, but it is a binder. And so it helps to bind. It helps to add bulk to our stool. So it can be helpful for anyone that's suffering from maybe some constipation or even diarrhea because it can help to bring water into the gut, which is good for constipation, but it's also binding, so it's good for diarrhea. So it's certainly helpful for that, but there are other sea vegetables that if someone wants to bring sea vegetables into their diet, personally, I recommend more. If someone's looking to get some of the different types of sea vegetables into their diet and get a little more nutritional benefit than sea moss gives, I do like nori. Nori is if you've ever gone to a Japanese restaurant and gotten a hand roll, it's the green sea vegetable wrapper that is usually used in most hand rolls. And so it has a very mild flavor. Again, it's a good source of this mucilaginous fiber, but it's also a good source of iodine. And so it can be very helpful for thyroid health. I also really like what's called dulse, which is another sea vegetable. It has it has a very briny flavor that I actually really like. But very little, about a gram a day will meet your daily values of iodine, and it has a lot of flavor. You can put it into salads and salad dressings and different things, or for people that want it without the taste, you can actually blend it into a smoothie if you drink something like smoothies and you'd never know it was there. But I like the nori and the dulse more as more potent sources of nutrients, but they also have that sticky mucilaginous fiber that can be nice. Uh, I would recommend staying away from certain sea vegetables. Specifically, I would recommend staying away from kelp, and I would recommend staying away from what's called hijiki. These are not very commonly found, especially in United States cooking. So it's not they're not the most common ones, but they are out there. Certain sea vegetables are toxically high in certain minerals that can actually be quite harmful if eaten in very large amounts. And hijiki and kelp can be especially high. So it's nothing to be afraid of or anything to be worried about. But if you're going to a store and you're thinking of experimenting with some of these different sea vegetables and you see kelp flakes, my recommendation would be to not use those and to maybe go with the nori flakes or the dulse flakes instead. Or if you're looking to make a seaweed salad, like if you go to, again, Japanese restaurants and you really like the seaweed salad they serve and you want to make that at home, I would look for other options. I wouldn't go with the hijiki or something like that, just because it can be problematically high in certain minerals. But I know I got a little off topic there from the sea moss, but if anyone has been using it and likes the texture of it, and you're noticing that it's good for your digestion, by all means, it's completely safe and fine to use. But I wouldn't personally recommend running out and purchasing it and using it unless you're just genuinely interested, because it's of all the sea vegetables we could go, it's not the most tasty. It actually is sort of flavorless, and it's an unusual texture, and so I find most people don't enjoy it. And I see a question here in the chat: where can you find nori and dulse, and how can you spell them? Not a problem. So I'll put these in the chat, but I'll say these out loud as well. for anyone that's not able to see. So nori is Nori, and dulse is Dulse. Where can you find them? Well, certain grocery stores, if they have an aisle that might have East Asian ingredients, often might have nothing, if nothing else, the nori, because people making their own homemade maki rolls and things like this is becoming more and more popular. I find natural food stores in particular and health food stores absolutely carry these products typically, or online. And there are some wonderful reputable brands out there. Eden Foods is one that typically has a wide variety of sea vegetables. I also like a brand called Maine Coast because it's literally sea vegetables that are harvested off the coast of Maine. And I use Dulse actually pretty often, and I will say that I purchased my Dulse through them, but by no means is this a plug for any one company. But Eden Foods, which again I'll type into the and then Maine Coast. Those are two brands. If you are so interested, I can at least say that I've purchased through them and have always really liked the products that they have. And if you're kind of curious as to get started but don't know where to begin, buy the little shakers. They're just like little cylinders that just have the sea vegetable ground up, and you can kind of just sprinkle the little shaker flakes onto salads, into soups, and just start to kind of see what you think about them and if you enjoy their flavor, and see what you and kind of enjoy in your cooking that way. And I see another question. I was recently diagnosed with anemia. Any suggestions? Well, without knowing more details from there, I will say my default answer to this is usually do not take an iron supplement. Unless you have been really specifically told you must use an iron supplement, I do not like iron supplements. They are constipating. They tend to cause a lot of digestive nausea and problems. And they usually don't get to the root of the problem. Because with anemia, the question we really want to answer is, why am I anemic? It's rarely due to poor iron in the diet. Sometimes it is, and there certainly can be causes of iron deficiency anemia, but it's rare. It's rare that somebody, the only reason they're anemic is they don't have enough iron. So really what we want to ask is, well, what can I do to improve my iron absorption from the iron of the foods I'm already eating to help with my anemia? And there are two different ways that, right? I shouldn't say that. There's several different ways, but two that I'll especially emphasize is vitamin C. Vitamin C helps us to absorb iron. Iron is found in whole grains. If anybody here is a fan of oats, like rolled oats for breakfast, rolled oats are an amazing source of iron. And so keep that up, because or if you don't usually use rolled oats for breakfast, I would suggest starting to use them if you're looking for a source of iron, because they really are a wonderful source of iron. Um, Combining something like oats with vitamin C rich foods, the vitamin C helps us to absorb the iron better. So for something like a breakfast meal, that could be something like eating oatmeal with a sliced up fresh orange or a couple clementines or something like that. Like that would be an amazing way to pair a high iron food like oats with a vitamin C rich food. Lentils are a wonderful source of iron, and pairing lentils with vitamin C rich foods like dark green leafy vegetables, like kale in particular, or bok choy if you enjoy bok choy. Also things like citrus. So if I make a lentil soup and I squeeze some fresh lemon juice into my bowl of lentil soup before I eat it, the lemon juice combined with the lentils is wonderful. Tomatoes are a wonderful source of vitamin C and these acids that are helpful. So if I put in some chopped tomatoes in my lentil soup, or if I'm making chickpeas, and I make like a chickpea salad with bell peppers. Bell peppers are a wonderful source of vitamin C. So chopping up bell peppers and other veggies and tossing them with chickpeas and lemon juice again and making a salad from it that way would be a wonderful way to combine high iron foods with vitamin C. And then also whole grains, especially whole wheat. So like whole wheat pita or 100% whole wheat bread are great sources of iron. And again, pairing them with something else in my meal, bell peppers, tomatoes, citrus, cooked tomato products like tomato paste or tomato sauce. So whole wheat pasta with tomato sauce or something like that. You're getting this wonderful combination. So combining vitamin C in all of your meals, and especially in foods that have whole grains, especially whole wheat, oats, and then beans and lentils, are excellent ways to get iron into your diet. The other thing is to avoid certain foods that block iron absorption. Wine, for example, not to keep beating up on wine tonight, but wine, especially red wine, is problematic for iron absorption. It contains polyphenols, which can block iron absorption. So if you usually have, again, a glass of red wine with dinner, let's say, well, any iron in that meal can be minimally absorbed now as a result. But there's other things that are rich sources of polyphenols as well. Cranberries and pomegranates. Now, these are wonderfully healthy foods, but if you combine them with iron-rich foods, it will block some of the iron absorption. So if you're a big fan of, let's say, pomegranate seeds, eat them separate from a meal. Or if you're a big fan of pomegranate juice or cranberry juice, consume them separate from a meal if when you're able to. That will help to get some distance between the polyphenols in the fruits and the iron in the food, and that can help with absorption. And then the other thing I'll say that can block iron absorption is calcium. I find that women in particular are heavily marketed to take calcium supplements, drink all this dairy products and other things, which is a whole topic in of itself. But too much calcium in the diet, or too much calcium at a single meal even, will block iron absorption. So if you take calcium supplements, you might want, if you still choose to use them, you might take them separate from meals. Or if you're consuming a lot of dairy foods like milk or cheese or yogurt, you might consider non-dairy alternatives. You might consider eating less of them or separating them from iron-rich foods, because all that calcium can block iron absorption too. So those are my typical go-to recommendations when it comes to anemia. Again, start there, give it a couple weeks, give it a couple months. Next time you get your iron levels checked, see if it has helped. But if you are combining vitamin C rich foods and really trying to emphasize some iron rich foods like whole wheat, oats, beans, peas, lentils, that usually can make a huge difference. And then especially if you're separating that from foods that are rich in polyphenols like wine, pomegranates, and cranberries, making sure I'm remembering everything, and as well as really high sources of calcium too. Kind of planning your foods in that way often makes a big benefit. So excellent questions. Thank you for putting those into the chat. So those are the questions that have been posed on the chat. Those are the questions that were posed online before. Samantha, any other questions that have been coming through Facebook or anything that I haven't had a chance to see yet?
So I'll give the folks on Facebook a little time because they are a little bit delayed from our Zoom call.
No problem.
But a question that I always get, just because of the patients and the people that we work with, is the link between sugar and cancer. Like a lot of our members are very concerned about their sugar intake because we always hear that, sugar feeds cancer cells.
Mm-hmm.
So could you talk a little bit about that? Maybe dispel some myths we might be hearing?
Absolutely. Good. And you reminded me of another thing that I'll say after that, but yes, let's talk about that. Does sugar feed cancer cells? Technically, the answer is yes, but not because sugars uniquely feed cancer cells. It's because all cells, all of the cells in my body, my eyes and my brain and everything else, loves sugar. So is it true that sugars feed cancer cells? Well, technically that's true, but that's like saying oxygen feeds my cells, right? Like, yes, exactly. They're alive. Every cell in our body, whether it's a healthy or not healthy cell, typically is going to be looking for glucose, is going to be looking for sugars to live. And there's a lot of fascinating discussion around this. I swear I won't bore you with, but the question typically then really needs to be reframed, which is, are sugary foods cancer causing? That's really what people are asking when they say, does sugar feed cancer cells? It's really, that's, I find what people want to know is, if I eat food that contains sugar, am I promoting cancer cell growth? And the answer to that is no. When you think about the food you eat, it is a collection of nutrients. It is not just one thing. The only exception, I suppose, would be if I just drank oil, then I guess that would just be pure fat. If I ate nothing but protein powder, then I guess that would be pure protein. Or if I ate a big bag of white sugar, then I guess I'd be eating nothing but sugar. Aside from those three things, every other food we put in our mouth, for the most part, is a collection of nutrients. And when we start to use words like sugar, it creates confusion. And that is very problematic because there are so many healthy foods, cancer preventing, cancer fighting foods that are also natural sources of dietary carbohydrates that we call sugars. But when we talk about sugar in dietetics and nutritional sciences, we're talking about these little carbon rings. We're not talking about a bag of sugar like you get at the grocery store. So, do sweet potatoes contain sugar? Yes. Does a bottle of soda contain sugar? Technically, yes. Is a sweet potato and a bottle of soda the same thing? No, they are not the same thing. And so I know that might sound kind of silly, but if you can answer that question, you are smarter than most people and more informed than most people who get this idea in their head that any dietary source of sugar is somehow bad for me. So if we look at this differently and say, are foods and diets that are high in processed extracted sugar, so white sugar, brown sugar, sugar syrups, these sorts of things, are they associated with increased risk of cancer? There does appear to be some association. Now, is that because white sugar, brown sugar, and sugar syrups cause cancer? No. But these are typically found in processed foods, right? Like, so it's sodas, it's cookies, it's ice cream, it's candies, it's syrups, it's all these various things. And we know, again, if we look at the American Institute of Cancer Research and many other organizations that do this work and a lot of public health, like epidemiology studies, we know that people who eat a lot of processed food typically are getting perhaps more calories than their body needs, and that can lead to some weight gain. And we do know that having additional body fat within the body, especially around the midsection, can be problematic for cancer risk. We know that these processed foods typically have little to no antioxidants. They are typically low in fiber. They typically don't have a lot of other micronutrients that we need. So, a person eating lots of sugary processed foods simultaneously might be getting too much calorie and not enough other nutrients that they need for good health. There is some research that suggests that high intakes of these processed extracted sugars can be a bit inflammatory within the body. And this word inflammation is getting used quite a lot right now, but there does appear that maybe diets that are incredibly rich in, again, these processed sugars can be a bit inflammatory. And many forms of cancer, as well as other chronic diseases, perhaps have some connection to chronic inflammation within the body. So, what does any of this mean for any practical use? Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, these technically contain carbohydrates, they contain sugars. These are not the foods to limit. If anything, these are the foods to maximize. The majority, the preponderance of the data shows that, again, diets highest in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, have the lowest risk of cancer, the most protective qualities. So this means it's not the sugar in my orange or the sugar in my banana or the sugar in my dried fruit, but I might then get some benefit from finding ways to replace or minimize extracted sugar. So, processed white sugar, brown sugar, syrups, these sorts of things, and sugary foods and processed foods. There is definitely benefits to finding ways to minimize and reduce those foods within the diet. My recommendation is to start slow. It can take couple weeks. It could take about a month or so for our taste buds to get used to changing flavors and tastes. So if I make myself coffee every day and I normally put in 2 tablespoons of sugar and I go from 2 tablespoons of white sugar to 0, that coffee is not going to taste the way I want it to. And I'm not going to, again, it's not going to be sustainable. So instead of going from 2 to 0, if I go from 2 tablespoons of coffee to 1.5 tablespoons, it'll taste a little less sweet, but not outrageously so. Do that for a month. Pretty soon, that coffee is going to taste the way it always tasted to you. Then, month 2, you go from 1.5 tablespoons to 1 tablespoon. Again, a little different, but not as different as it was what you were doing before. Give it a couple weeks till you're feeling really good. Try a 0.5 tablespoon. How does that feel? Is that still okay? Maybe you stop there, or maybe you eventually go to 1/4 of a tablespoon, or whatever that would be. But it's slow, bit by bit by bit by bit. I like things like maple syrup and honey and those sorts, and agave syrup as sources of sweet, not because they're really all that much different than white sugar or anything else, but because they have flavor. If you glug a lot of maple syrup onto something, you're not just adding sweet, but you're adding a flavor, you're adding maple to it. And it comes very easy that you've overdone it and all you taste is maple and your food's ruined. So I find sometimes that these other sources of sweeteners, brown rice syrup, coconut sugar, maple syrup, etc., they can be nice as a way to, again, start to change up the flavor a bit, but it's a little bit less until you find an amount that you can put in where your food is still enjoyable, but is no doubt a lot less of these added sugars than you were adding to your food before. And if there's really only one change that you start to make with is sugar sweetened beverages. If there is one consistently studied, consistently reported thing about sugar and health, it is the problem of sugar sweetened beverages. So sodas, soft drinks, sugar sweetened teas. And let's face it, most processed vegetable and fruit juices that you buy in a bottle are just basically sugar sweetened beverages. So even just starting to find alternatives to those, cutting those out, etc., that will make a huge difference. But using some sweetener in your food is not going to increase your risk for cancer or any condition. And then the other, just last thing I'll say with that really quickly again is do not limit then the sweet taste you're getting from fruits, the sweet taste that you're getting from dates and all these other great things. Your brain wants to make sure it's getting enough sweet taste. And so if you go from all these sweet foods to nothing, it's like where we started, where you go from all this fat to nothing. It's going to taste so different and so unenjoyable. Nobody's going to want to stick with that type of awful way of eating. But if I'm using lots of fruit and I'm using lots of sweet vegetables like squashes and sweet potatoes and these sorts of things in my cooking, I'm still giving my taste buds and my tongue and my brain lots of sweet taste. And maybe my craving for lots of candy and lots of ice cream and lots of other intensely sweet sources starts to go down because I'm giving myself lots of sweet taste throughout the day. And then I had said that question made me think of something else. So thank you, because I wanted to mention this before with the Mediterranean diet. Another common thing with the Mediterranean diet is soy foods, tofu, tempeh, miso, soy milk. Very often people get worried, especially with breast cancer. Please let me be abundantly clear. Not only are soy foods not a problem for breast cancer, most, if not all, practically all of the research shows soy foods are protective against breast cancer, even estrogen receptive positive forms of breast cancer. Now, if you don't like soy foods and you don't want to start eating tofu, that is fine. No one needs to start to go out and start buying soy foods. But please know that tofu, tempeh, edamame, soy milk, miso, these sorts of things, they are not causative, they are not problematic. And in most of the research being done, they've been shown to actually be protective. These phytoestrogens are actually beneficial for breast cancer and many other forms of cancer like prostate cancer and other things as well. So please do not be afraid of good quality soy foods out there. These are not the sources of nutrients that are causing concerns when it comes to breast health or anything like that. So I know that was a bit of a non sequitur, but I just wanted to make sure we got that in.
Okay, so I'll just do, oh, someone just asked a question in the chat, actually.
Yes, I just saw that too. So I've been told processed soy foods are bad. Well, the thing we want to remember there is really it's the P word. It's processed. It has nothing to do with the soy. Just like you might say, processed anything may not be quite so good for our health. So if I buy a block of tofu and I'm cooking it, if I'm buying a brick of tempeh and cooking it, or I'm putting soy milk in my whole grain cereal, that's different than I bought a pizza made of soy, or I bought a, soy ice cream double chocolate chip sandwich or something like that. Anything processed. There's a way to process kale and make it bad for you, I promise. Like any food that is, stripped of its fiber, that has a bunch of processed fats added to it, a bunch of extracted other things, it's not the soy, it's what we did to the soy that makes it problematic. So I sometimes use the term like whole soy food. So again, tofu, tempeh, soy milk, edamame, miso, these sorts of things, they are not problematic. They are not something to be limited. And again, in many cases, they can actually be protective.
Okay, so if anybody in Facebook or on Zoom has questions, please put them in your respective chats and I'll read them out loud.
And I just saw again a follow up like soy burgers. I would say it depends on the burger. If it's a soy burger where it's like crumbled up tofu and it's flour to bind it up and it's got some I don't know, carrots or peas or onions or the things that they put into these sorts of things, probably not too bad. If it's something that's almost completely unrecognizable from what a soybean would ever look like, it depends. And it's again not the soy's fault, but often like these heavily processed plant burgers and things like that, whether it's made from soy or anything, can often be really hefty sources of saturated fat. They can sometimes be incredibly high sources of salt. Those are the things that really we want to pay more attention to. Any food we kind of want to look at holistically in this way. So if it's a soy burger where it's you could actually like almost make it at home. Like if you're looking at it, you're like, I could actually cook this. It's probably not as processed than something that literally looks like it came, from a cow, where that has been really far removed from any food it might have once been. Which, just like any processed food, typically it's going to be really high in fat, really high in salt, potentially really high in those processed sugars again, and not as much fiber and other nutrients as we might like. So these have been absolutely wonderful, fantastic questions. Any other questions on anyone's mind at this time? So I want to make sure I'm not missing anything.
All right. So
Excellent.
if anybody has any questions that Anthony didn't get to tonight or something pops up for you later, you can always either message Gilda's Club and I can forward it to him. You can also email me at samantha@gildasclubsouthjersey.org. And again, I'll send your questions to Anthony and hopefully we can get you an answer. Um,
Absolutely.
Anthony, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your infinite wisdom on nutrition because it's a hefty topic and I know it's always on a lot of people's minds as we start a new year. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your fantastic questions. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do this again soon.
All right, everybody have a great night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night, everyone.